The glass wall shattered as the security guard lunged, his badge clipped to a holstered Glock. I barely got my laptop up in time, the screen cracking against his fist. Now I'm trapped in the parking garage, my breath fogging the cold air, clutching a file that says, "I'm not who I thought." 30 years of lies, and the only proof is the birth certificate in my shaking hands. The engine roars behind me. Too late to run. The name on the paper isn't mine. The date is. And the woman who raised me was never pregnant. The tires squeal. I have 3 seconds before the car hits. The study smelled of stale lilies and the metallic tang of an old radiator. Sarah Miller's thumb traced the frayed edge of Robert's leather-bound ledger, the skin of her hand appearing translucent under the harsh desk lamp. Dust motes danced in the yellow beam as she flipped past neat columns of mortgage payments and grocery tallies. Her lungs burned with the dry air of a room sealed since the funeral. Midway through the 3rd decade of their marriage, the handwriting shifted. Robert's precise script slanted, cramped by some unspoken urgency. "Item 104, she whispered. The phrase repeated every 28th of the month, a rhythmic pulse in the ink. Each entry drained $4,000 into an untraceable void. Sarah gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. The wood felt cold, biting into her palms. She reached for the glass of lukewarm water, but her fingers trembled, sending a small ripple across the surface. Outside, a crow screeched, the sound tearing through the suburban silence. She pulled a stack of bank statements from the bottom drawer. The paper crinkled, sharp and insistent. Item 104 stared up from the June statement, then May, then April. The numbers blurred into a gray smear. She rubbed her eyes, smelling the faint scent of Robert's cedarwood cologne lingering on the chair's upholstery. It clung to the fabric, a ghost refusing to leave. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11, a heavy bronze thud echoing against the floorboards. 30 years of shared breakfasts and quiet evenings dissolved into these precise, recurring subtractions. Sarah gripped a ballpoint pen until the plastic groaned. She circled the last entry, the blue ink bleeding into the fiber of the page. The discrepancy was more than a financial error. It was a structural failure in the architecture of her life. Sarah lived by the ledger. Her Apology Ledger app on her phone sat open next to the bank statements, a digital record of every slight she'd ever endured. Robert had never appeared in it much. He had been the steady variable, the one person whose math always added up. Now, the sum of her father was changing before her eyes. She leaned back, the leather chair groaning under her slight weight. The silence of the Chicago suburbs was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She needed more than these paper ghosts. She needed the source. The next morning, the air in the Miller Global headquarters was chilled to a precise 62 degrees. Sarah sat at her workstation, her fingers dancing across the keys with a mechanical rhythm. The hum of the cooling fans beneath her desk was a low, vibrating growl that she felt in her marrow. She wasn't just an auditor today. She was a hunter. She bypassed the first layer of the company's digital gates, the ones meant to keep out casual prying. To her, they were like paper-thin curtains. She watched the data flow, a river of numbers and names, searching for the jagged rock that was item 104. Her vision narrowed until the glass-walled office around her vanished, replaced by the glowing schematic of her father's secret. There it was, a ghost account. It didn't have a name, only a destination, a shell company registered in Blackwood, West Virginia. The name of the town felt like grit in her teeth. Blackwood. It sounded like a place where things went to be buried. As she dug deeper, the item 104 entries began to reveal their true nature. They weren't just transfers. They were payments. Systematic, rhythmic, and heavy. 30 years of bribery. 30 years of blood money diverted from the main veins of Miller Global into this Appalachian void. The sheer volume of the theft was staggering. Robert hadn't just been cooking the books, he'd been burning the kitchen down one floorboard at a time. A shadow fell across her desk. Sarah didn't look up, her eyes still fixed on the scrolling green text. "The math doesn't track, Marcus," she said, her voice a flat metallic rasp. "Sarah, you need to stop." Marcus, her assistant, sounded breathless. His footsteps were uneven, stumbling over the plush carpet. "I saw the security logs. Someone is watching your terminal. Not the IT guys. Someone from the executive floor." Sarah finally looked up. Marcus was pale, his tie slightly crooked, a variance she would usually note in her ledger. But the panic in his eyes stopped her. "I have logged your concern," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "But the data is incomplete. I need the origin point." "There is no origin point for people like us if we get caught," Marcus hissed. Before he could finish, the heavy glass door of the office swung open with a pneumatic hiss. A man in a dark security uniform stepped inside. Sarah's internal alarm spiked. He was too broad for the standard issue vest, and he didn't have the Miller Global insignia on his shoulder. He moved with a heavy, predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room like a thermal sensor. "Ms. Miller," the man said. His voice was like grinding stones. "There's a reported leak in this sector. I need you to step away from the machine." Sarah didn't move. She saw the way his hand hovered near his belt. Not a taser. The shape was too sharp, too heavy. "I am currently auditing the sincerity of your claim," she said, her fingers surreptitiously reaching for her heavy, metal-cased laptop. "And your credentials remain outstanding." The man didn't argue. He lunged. The world blurred into a series of violent, staccato impacts. Sarah swung the laptop with both hands, the solid weight of the machine catching the man across the bridge of his nose. There was a sickening crunch, the sound of dry wood snapping. He roared, a spray of red dotting the white marble of her desk. He reached for her, his fingers like iron hooks. Sarah ducked, the scent of his cheap tobacco and sweat filling her lungs. She grabbed the heavy mahogany desk drawer, pulling it out with a scream of metal on metal, and slammed it shut onto the man's reaching hand. The howl that tore from his throat vibrated through the glass walls. She didn't wait to see him recover. She grabbed the physical item 104 file, the one Robert had hidden in his personal safe, and bolted. Her heels clicked frantically against the polished floor, a frantic, uneven heartbeat echoing through the sterile hallway. She reached the parking garage, the air thick with the smell of stagnant gasoline and damp concrete. The low ceiling felt like it was descending, a gray weight pressing against her skull. She dove into her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled the key into the ignition. A black sedan roared to life 3 rows down, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. It lunged forward, tires screaming against the epoxy floor. Sarah slammed her car into reverse, the jolt throwing her against the seatbelt. The sedan missed her bumper by an inch, slamming into a concrete pillar with a deafening thud that shook the air. She didn't look back. She tore out of the garage, the bright Chicago sun blinding her for a moment as she veered onto the expressway. Miles later, parked in a narrow, trash-strewn alley behind a boarded-up diner, Sarah finally let her breath out. Her chest ached, her hands were raw. She reached for the item 104 file on the passenger seat. The paper felt heavy, like it was made of lead. Subverted beat 1.4. Sarah flipped the file open. This was the missing piece. This was the logic that would reconcile the 30-year variance in her father's life. She expected to find a contract, a deed to a property, or perhaps the name of a mistress. That would make sense. That would fit the profile of a man like Robert Miller. Her eyes landed on a yellow document, its edges brittle. It was a birth certificate. She scanned the lines. Place of birth? Blackwood, West Virginia. Date, August 14th, her own birthday. She felt a small, confident smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Robert had kept a record of her birth, perhaps a sentimental gesture he couldn't share with the cold, marble-like Catherine. It was logical. It was even, in a strange way, kind. Then she read the name of the mother, Elena Vance. The name hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She read it again. Then she looked at the mother's signature line. It wasn't Catherine's sharp, elegant script. It was a shaky, unpracticed scrawl. Sarah's breath hitched. She looked at the adoptive parent rider attached to the back. There was a contract. A bill of sale. Miller Global agrees to a lump sum payment of $50,000, followed by monthly residuals of $4,000, to be paid to Elena Vance for the permanent transfer of the asset. The word asset was underlined in red ink. Sarah felt the world tilt. The alleyway seemed to shrink, the brick walls closing in. She reached out to touch the dashboard. But her hand felt like it belonged to a stranger. She wasn't a daughter. She wasn't a Miller. She was a line item. She was a item 104. For 30 years she had looked into Catherine's eyes and seen a mother's coldness, thinking it was just a personality trait. Now she realized it was the coldness of a shareholder looking at a depreciating investment. Catherine had never been pregnant. The stories of the difficult labor, the miracle of birth, they were all scripted marketing copy. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She smelled the iron of the blood on her sleeve from the hitman, mixed with the scent of the old, rotting paper in her lap. She had spent her life trying to balance a ledger that was built on a foundation of zero. She was a ghost in her own life, a fraudulent entry in the family history. The phone in her pocket buzzed. A text from Catherine. "Control the optics, Sarah. Bring the file home and we can reconcile this. Don't be a bad investment." Sarah stared at the screen. The apology ledger was still open in the background. She typed in Catherine Miller. For the reason, she wrote, existing. She didn't hit save. She threw the phone out the window, watching it shatter against the pavement. The data didn't matter anymore. The truth was afire, and she was standing in the center of the blaze. She put the truck in gear. She wasn't going home. She was going to Blackwood. She was going to find the woman who had sold her, and she was going to find out exactly what her soul was worth on the open market. The drive to West Virginia was a blur of gray asphalt and skeletal trees. Sarah's luxury sedan felt like a neon sign, a tracking beacon for the woman who owned her. Every time she passed a highway patrol car, her pulse spiked. She could feel Catherine's reach, a cold, invisible hand stretching across the state lines. She pulled into a rest stop outside of Charleston. The air smelled of diesel and fried onions. She walked to the back of the lot, where a rusted-out Ford F-150 sat with a "for sale" sign taped to the cracked windshield. An old man in a grease-stained cap sat on the tailgate, chewing on a toothpick. Sarah didn't haggle. She took off her Cartier watch, the one Robert had given her for her 30th birthday, and pressed it into the man's calloused palm. "The truck and a paper map," she said. The man looked at the gold watch, then at Sarah's sharp, terrified eyes. He didn't ask questions. He handed her the keys. The metal was warm from the sun, a sharp contrast to the cold glass of her abandoned car. The truck smelled of wet dog and stale tobacco. The engine turned over with a violent, coughing roar that vibrated through the floorboards. It was loud. It was ugly. And it was invisible. She navigated the winding mountain roads by the crinkle of the paper map, avoiding the main arteries where the digital eyes of the world could see her. Blackwood was a town that time had forgotten to bury. The houses clung to the hillsides like barnacles on a sinking ship. The smell of coal dust was thick here, a sulphurous grit that coated the back of Sarah's throat. She drove past a playground where the swings had been removed, the empty chains swaying in the wind like nooses. She found the Vance residence at the end of a gravel road. It was a small, lopsided shack with a porch that groaned under the weight of a rusted washing machine. The front door was hanging off one hinge, the wood splintered. "Elena," Sarah called out. Her voice sounded thin in the heavy mountain silence. She stepped inside. The house had been turned inside out. Drawers were dumped on the floor, the contents scattered like white leaves. A half-eaten bowl of cereal sat on the table, the milk turned into a thick, gray skin. Sarah's boots crunched on broken glass. She moved toward the bedroom, her eyes scanning the floor for a pattern, a variance. Near the closet, a floorboard sat slightly higher than the others. She knelt, her fingers catching on a splinter. She pried the board up. Inside was a small, metal box, and inside that box was a photograph. It was a woman, younger, with tired eyes and a forced smile, holding a baby wrapped in a white onesie. The woman had Sarah's chin, Sarah's nose. On the back, in the same shaky scrawl from the birth certificate, were the words, "My little debt." Sarah clutched the photo. The paper was cool against her skin. For the first time in 30 years, she saw a face that mirrored her own. But the connection was interrupted by a heavy thud from the kitchen. She froze. The local stray dogs outside had stopped barking. The air in the house grew still. A shadow stretched across the hallway, long and jagged. A man stepped into the doorway. He was local, weathered skin, a jagged scar across his knuckles, and eyes that were empty of everything but a paycheck. He held a tire iron in one hand, the metal dull and heavy. "You shouldn't have come here, city girl," the man said. He cracked his knuckles in a rhythmic 1, 2, 3. Pop, pop, pop. Sarah's mind went into forensic mode. Distance, 6 feet. Weapon, blunt force. Exit, blocked. "Who hired you?" she asked, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The man didn't answer. He lunged, swinging the tire iron in a wide, clumsy arc. Sarah ducked, the metal whistling over her head and smashing into the wooden doorframe with a splintering crash. She scrambled back into the kitchen, her hand hitting the counter. Her fingers closed around a bottle of bleach and a jug of ammonia sitting under the sink. She didn't think. She poured them both into a plastic bucket, the chemical reaction instant and violent. A sharp, stinging cloud of gas erupted. The man stumbled into the kitchen, coughing, his eyes streaming tears. What did you do?" Sarah grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. She swung it with every ounce of rage she'd carried since reading that birth certificate. The clong of the metal against his skull was loud and final. He crumpled to the floor, the tire iron clattering away. She didn't stay to see if he was breathing. She bolted out the back door, sprinting into the thick, hostile woods. The branches scratched at her face, the damp cold seeping through her thin shoes. She ran until her lungs burned, until the sound of her own breathing was the only thing she could hear. She emerged near a small, darkened diner on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered. Joe's. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and old grease. A man sat at the counter, his back to her. He was barrel-chested, with a ring of 50 keys jingling on his belt as he shifted in his seat. "James Hudson?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The man turned. His eyes were rimmed with red, the eyes of a man who hadn't slept in decades. "I figured you'd show up eventually, Sarah. You look just like her, before the world broke her." "The sheriff," Sarah whispered. "You were the one who signed the papers." James sighed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "I was a young man who needed a house and a life. The Millers offered both for a signature. I've been carrying the keys to that mistake ever since." He led her to a back booth, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. "You want to know what you are? You're not just a daughter, Sarah. You're a hedge." He opened the envelope. Inside was a legal trust, the language dense and cold. "Robert Miller didn't just buy you to have an heir," James said, his voice low. "He bought you to secure the Miller global tax-exempt status. There's a clause in the corporate charter. The estate remains tax-free as long as there is a direct blood heir in control. But Catherine couldn't have kids. So they bought one. And they set up Item 104 to keep the biological mother quiet." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "And if I find out?" James looked at her, his expression grim. "The trust has a liquidation clause. If the heir becomes aware of the fraudulent nature of their birth before the age of 35, the assets are frozen. Unless I die," Sarah finished. "Then the money flows to the secondary beneficiary," James said. "Catherine." The realization was a physical weight. Her life wasn't a gift. It was a ticking clock. She was a placeholder for a fortune she was never meant to truly own. "We need to find Elena," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "She's the only one who can testify to the fraud." James stood up, his keys jingling a mournful tune. "She's at the old mine. Catherine's people took her there an hour ago. They're cleaning up the loose ends, Sarah, and you're the biggest one left." The Blackwood mine was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, surrounded by rusted machinery and jagged fences. Sarah and James approached through the woods, the rain starting to fall in a cold, persistent drizzle. "I have to go in alone," Sarah whispered. "If they see a sheriff, they'll kill her before we reach the door." James handed her a heavy flashlight. "Be careful, kid. That place is a maze of bad memories." Sarah slipped through a rusted ventilation shaft, the smell of damp earth and old rot filling her senses. She crawled through the dark, the sound of rhythmic, mechanical dripping echoing through the shafts. It sounded like a heartbeat. She reached a high-security subterranean level. The transition was jarring, from rotting wood to polished steel and glowing blue keypads. She found a biometric panel, the lights mocking her. She didn't have a finger scan, but she had a battery from her flashlight and a copper wire from a discarded lamp. She touched the wire to the sensor. A spark erupted, the smell of scorched plastic filling the air. The door hissed open. She stepped into a central command room. A wall of monitors showed the various levels of the mine. On the center screen, she saw a black SUV pull up to the entrance. Catherine Miller stepped out. She looked impeccable, even in the rain. Her charcoal suit was crisp, her hair carved from marble. She looked at the mine entrance with the same bored expression she used at charity galas. Sarah felt a surge of cold fury. She ran toward the primary elevator shaft, her boots echoing on the metal grating. She reached the entrance just as the elevator hissed open. Catherine was there, flanked by two men in suits. Michael Reed, the hitman from the office, stood to her left, his tie perfectly straight. He adjusted it 3 times. Shh, shh, shh. Sarah, Catherine said, her voice a glacial sweep. We find this pursuit tedious. The math is over, Catherine, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the vast dark shaft. I know about the trust. I know about the item 104 payments. I know I'm a bill of sale. Catherine sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. You were an investment, Sarah, a very expensive one. We expected a better return than this forensic tantrum. I'm not an asset, Sarah spat. I'm a human being. In this world, darling, there is no difference, Catherine said. She nodded to Michael. The struggle was brief and violent. Sarah lunged for the security console, trying to trigger the emergency lockdown. Michael caught her arm, his grip like a vice. Sarah kicked out, her heel catching him in the shin. She twisted, her fingers frantically dancing across the keypad. A heavy industrial security gate began to descend, a wall of solid steel meant to seal the mine in case of a collapse. No! Catherine screamed, her composure finally breaking. Sarah dove. She rolled across the wet concrete, the heavy gate missing her legs by an inch. It slammed shut with a bone-jarring thud that shook the entire mountain. Sarah was inside. Catherine was outside. She was trapped in the dark, but she was free of the woman who bought her. She turned the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the gloom. She had to find Elena. She had to find the woman who could end this. She moved deeper into the mine, following the sound of a low, rhythmic humming. She found a reinforced holding cell at the end of a long tunnel. Inside, a woman sat on a cot, her back to the door. Helena? Sarah whispered. The woman turned. She looked older than the photo, her skin weathered like old leather. She didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed. You should have stayed in Chicago, Sarah, Elena said. Her voice was thin and sharp. I'm here to get you out, Sarah said, fumbling with the lock. We can go to the authorities. We can stop Catherine. Subverted beat 3.5. Sarah felt a surge of hope. This was it. The moment of connection. She would save her mother, and together they would dismantle the Miller Empire. It was the logical conclusion. It was the justice she deserved. The lock is old, Sarah said, her fingers working the mechanism. Just a few more seconds, and we're gone. I have a car waiting. We can get you somewhere safe. Elena didn't move. She didn't even stand up. Safe? You think I want to be safe in some government housing? Sarah paused, the metal wire in her hand trembling. What? Do you have any idea how much $4,000 a month is in this town? Elena asked. She stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. It's a palace. It's a life where I don't have to breathe coal dust. It's a life where I don't have to work until my fingers bleed. But they bought me, Sarah said, her voice cracking. They stole my life. I didn't sell you to lose you, Sarah, Elena said, stepping closer to the bars. I sold you to save myself, and you're ruining it. You're auditing my retirement. Sarah felt a cold prickle dance across her skin. Something was wrong. Elena's posture, it wasn't that of a victim. She was looking past Sarah, toward the shadows of the tunnel. Elena? I told them you'd come here, Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. I called the number on the back of the check. I told them if they wanted to keep the payments coming, they had to stop you. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. The world tilted, the damp walls of the mine seeming to breathe. She hadn't come here to rescue a mother. She had come to be betrayed by one. You tipped them off? You're a smart girl, Sarah. Elena said, a cruel smile touching her lips. You should have known. Everything has a price. And right now, your silence is worth more than your life. A shadow moved in the tunnel behind Sarah. She turned, but it was too late. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth, the smell of industrial bleach and old blood filling her senses. Noted for the record, Michael Reed whispered in her ear. They stripped her of her bag, her files, and her hope. They dragged her to a windowless, reinforced storage room and threw her inside. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a coffin lid. Sarah sat in the dark, the smell of bleach suffocating her. She was a line item that had been deleted. She was a item 104 that had reached its expiration date. But as she sat there, her fingers brushed against the floor. She felt a loose wire from a discarded lamp. Her mind, trained in the cold logic of forensics, began to work. The Millers had taught her that people were assets. But they had forgotten one thing. An asset can also be a weapon. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't pray. She reached for the wire and began to audit the lock. The internal mechanism of the electronic lock was a simple sequence of pulses. To most, it was a black box. To Sarah, it was a conversation. She stripped the wire with her teeth, the copper tasting of pennies and electricity. She touched the lead to the battery she'd hidden in her sock, a small AAA cell from the flashlight. Click, The door didn't just open, it surrendered. Sarah slipped out into the hallway. She didn't head for the exit. She headed for the server room. If she was going to be deleted, she was going to take the entire ledger with her. She found the central hub, the glowing blue lights of the servers humming a digital requiem. She plugged her phone, the one she'd taken from the guard during the scuffle, into the main port. Her fingers flew across the screen. She didn't just find the item 104 account. She found the item 1 through item 1000. It was a map of every bribe, every embezzlement, and every fraud the Millers had committed in 30 years. She didn't hesitate. She initiated a total liquidation. She watched the numbers drop. Millions of dollars diverted into 1,000 untraceable charities across the globe. She watched the Miller Global stock price flicker and die. She watched the item 104 account hit zero. She walked out of the mine as the sun was beginning to rise over the Appalachian peaks. The air was cold and clean, the scent of rain-washed pine replacing the sulfur of the coal. Catherine was there, standing by her SUV. She looked at her phone, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. What have you done? I reconciled the account, Catherine, Sarah said, her voice calm and flat. The debt is paid, in full. Elena stood nearby, her face twisted in a mask of greed and fury. My money! You brat, that was my money. Sarah didn't even look at her. She walked past them, her boots steady on the gravel. She didn't need a mother. She didn't need a name. She was the only person who knew the true value of her soul, and it wasn't for sale. A month later, Sarah sat in a small, sterile office in Seattle. The gray mist of the Pacific Northwest blurred the horizon, softening the edges of the world. There were no mirrors in the room. There were no ledgers on the desk. Only a new laptop, its screen glowing with a clean, white light. She looked at the skyline, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. She wasn't a Miller. She wasn't a Vance. She was Sarah. And for the first time in her life, the math finally added up.